Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and nice to see you all. Sorry that I arrived a little late. And welcome back after the recent break to our new sugya. I think I always begin every new sugya like that, so I don't want to bore anyone, but I've been struggling a little bit with this sugya. I thought it was a sort of fairly simple, short sugya, but it proves a little more complicated than I had realized. I'll do my best to try and work our way through the sugya. So this is a one-line sugya. It's at the bottom of Ein Daled on the base. The Gemara continues to analyze the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, "Tofer states furus," someone who stitches 2 stitches. There's obviously a number of questions that spring to mind when one learns this line in the Mishnah. These are 3 words in the Mishnah. The first are our normal questions. What exactly is the melachot of Tofer? Sewing, what's included in it, what isn't included in it, how can we define it? The second is why does the Mishnah specify over here state furus? Is this a shear, a normal measure, or is this something else? And we'll try and work through these things, but for now we're just going to read the Gemara. I would reference, though, that a lot of what we are going to say is going to be linked to the last sugya of kosher. We touched a little bit upon Tofer there, and I'm going to try and reference back to it, but for those of you who missed anything on kosher or who need refreshing, please have a listen to the recordings. They're all available on their YouTube channel, and I posted the links in the WhatsApp group. Please listen to the recordings on kosher also, because as we discussed then, both kosher and Tofer have commonalities. They're both connecting melachos, about connecting disparate pieces together. And we discussed there what exactly is the difference between kosher and Tofer. For example, gluing 2 pieces together, is that knotting or is that Tofer? Have a listen to those Shiur, and then I will do a little bit of chaburah, but definitely worth having a relook at those sources and the Mara Makomas. In fact, the first Mara Mokum I put on the printed handout sheets, the Ramah in Simon Shin Yod Zayin, Sif Gimel, was on the previous handout sheet when we looked at kosher also, so that was explicitly a repetition. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. Ask the Gemara, this malacha is not kayim, it's not permanent, it has no kiyum to it. Again, a concept we already met when we learned the malacha of kosher. You're correct. Tefira, stitching in and out, which is shtei tefirus, is not a malacha that has a kiyum. This must be talking about where you tie a kesher, a knot, in order to fix the thread and stop it slipping out. So says the Gemara. Now there's 2 parts to our short sugya. The first part is the question, and the second part is the answer. In other words, the question assumes that kosher without knots, Tofer, stitching without knots is not kayim, and it assumes that not being kayim is a problem in the malacha. It's a limitation, a problem in the malacha. That's part 1 of the sugya. And part 2 of the sugya assumes that knots resolves this problem. So we're going to break the sugya into 2 parts and learn each part by itself. The first part is, what is this issue of the kesher not being kayim? And the second part will be, not in today's shiur, but in the future shiur, will be, of the Tofer, the tefira, the stitch not being kayim. What's this issue of the stitch not being permanent? And the second issue will be, what's the answer of the Gemara of the knots, and how does that all work out? Now, I can't repeat this enough, and B'li Neder, I will say this point on every malacha we learn. Yet again, this Gemara is a battering ram against the ideology that I was taught to fight when I learned in yeshivas, which is the idea that you can resolve anything by blindly saying this is a gezeras hakosov, this is just what the pasuk rules. In Brisk, we are taught to loathe that way of thinking. And I've said this many times in the Shabbos, and I just want to repeat it again. What does the Gemara mean? How dare the Gemara ask, v'halei kaima, it's not permanent? If this is a malacha that took place in the Mishnah, then who cares whether it's permanent or not? Evidently, this is a malacha. The Gemara shouldn't say v'halo kaima. The Gemara should say, evidently we're wrong in thinking that you need something to be kayam, because the Mishnah and indeed the events of the Mishkan tell us that sowing is a melacha. So what does the Gemara mean v'halo kaima? And yet again, this reminds us of the idea that is central to Torah Sheba'al Peh, that Torah Sheba'al Peh has to be a partnership between human reason and what the Torah is telling us. And therefore, Chazal felt entitled to say, we are not willing to accept that this is a malacha, since it doesn't make sense that this is a malacha. You can't just blindly apply everything that takes place in the Mishnah and in the Mishkan and say that's all a malacha. We have to use our reason. It has to be things which qualify for malacha, that are creative acts that count as malachas. And I said, Kohanim, presumably when they built the Mishkan, sneezed. Presumably they said, pass me the scissors when they were in the Mishkan. We don't make those things just into malachas. Similarly, we don't take all the conditions that took place in the Mishkan into malachas and say, well, it's only a kohen who does something on Shabbos who is transgressing Shabbos, or it's only if you're wearing white, or it's only if you're in a desert, or it's only if you're a certain age. We have to use our reason to determine what are the determining factors that make something a malacha, and therefore, even though this took place in the Mishkan, the Gemara doesn't just say, therefore, evidently this is a malacha. The Gemara says this can't qualify as a malacha because we know what a malacha is. A malacha has to be something that is a significant achievement, and part of this significance is that it has a kiyum to it, though we will unpick this a little bit later and see whether that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. So this is the first point I want to say, and I've said this many, many times. Whenever we meet a Gezeres HaKosov, it's not just enough to say this is what the Torah says. We need to understand what the Torah is saying and how we can comprehend what this is saying. This is very different to why. And this is why Reb Chaim Brisker famously used to say, Frag nicht farvos, frag vos. Don't ask why, but what, when you're learning Gemara. We're not here attempting to understand why this is problematic. We don't have a problem with the chok. If we know what the chok is telling us, even though we don't understand, of course we'll accept it. But we have to know what it's telling us. And when it comes to Shabbos, what it's telling us is very article malacha. Don't do a malacha, and therefore we have to understand what the concept of malacha is. And the Gemara thinks very carefully about the concept of malacha and understands that malacha has to be approximately in the territory of a significant achievement. And part of what it sees as significance, it has to have a kiyum. If it has no kiyum, then it isn't a malacha. So this is the first premise of the Gemara, that the Gemara says that even if Tofer took place in the Mishkan, it's not enough to answer, what do you mean Tofer took place in the Mishkan? We are entitled to say, but this, if it's a fear that doesn't have a kiyum, that can't be what was the malacha, that can't be that which we are learning out from the Mishkan. So this is the first point. What is this issue of the holokaim, and what is the question? It doesn't have a kiyum. So here we turn to Rashi. It doesn't remain like this. So now Rashi's words ring in our ears with a greater ring. Since it's not kaim, it isn't a malacha. The Torah says no article malacha. We learn malachas from the Mishkan. If Tofer is not kaim, lav malacha, it isn't a malacha. It can't be a malacha. This is what Rashi says. Then the Gemara answers Shekosha Shnei Roshei Achut. The two heads of the thread were knotted, and we'll look at that later when we get to the second half of the Gemara. So this is the start of the sugya. Now, the big question that we need to understand over here is what is this issue of lo kaima? Why actually does it matter? So what I've said so far is that the Gemara holds that kiyum is essential to the definition of malacha, has to have some permanence. But what exactly is this issue of lo kaima? And again, I don't want to repeat that which we looked at in Tofer. So I simply want to reference the discussion that we had over there, where we spoke extensively about many malachas having this feature of kiyum, of needing to be kiyum. We saw many other scenarios where the Gemara and the halachic sources assume that you need to have a degree of kiyum associated with a malacha. This isn't unique to our malacha. We saw it with, actually we referenced their Tofer as one of the examples. We saw it with Kosev, we saw it with Boina. Many malachas have a concept of needing kiyum associated with them. Now, when we looked at Tofer, Kosher, just to remind you, we came to the conclusion that Tofer had unusual features. It wasn't part of the general pattern of malachas of needing kiyum. There were additional elements to the kiyum that kosher needed. particularly that normally the definition of kiyum or not kiyum is structural, objective. Is the work that's been done something that has a degree of permanence to it or not? Now, nothing lasts forever, but it has to have a degree of permanence to it. So if one writes on water vapor on a window, this wouldn't be the melachot of kosev because it's going to fade very, very quickly. If one writes on paper, it would be the melachot of kosev, even though even paper and writing doesn't last forever. It will eventually fade if you give it enough time. So normally speaking, the definition of kiyum is objective structural permanence. Similarly with a binyan, is it objectively, structurally a building that has permanence, at least as far as derisa law is concerned. With kosher, we saw that it is also subjective, meaning even if the knot is a jolly good knot, nonetheless, if my intention is to unravel it, that's enough to take it away from being the melacha. And this was mufurish in the Gemara. The Gemara says it's kosher manas lahati. It's making a knot with intention to be matir, to unravel the knot. So kosher turns out to have unique qualities different to the general rule of kiyum. Similarly, we saw that normally when a melacha doesn't have a kiyum, it is potter avalosa, meaning to say even though min haTorah it's not a melacha, and therefore it's potter, there's no chiyuv, nonetheless it's also rabbinically there's a general rabbinic gezerah across the board that melachas that don't have a kiyum are still osa. With kosher, we saw that in a situation where it didn't have this kiyum, it's mutter, which again was part of this pattern of understanding that kosher is different, the kiyum in kosher is different to the kiyum in other melachas, there's somehow more of a need for permanence associated with kosher than other melachas. And that's what we discussed when we learned kosher. And I simply now want to translate across this question with respect to Tofer, with respect to sewing. Is this like all melachas, just a general rule that a stitch needs to be structurally sound and permanent, as opposed to a stitch which is so loose that it has no permanence to it? Or is this about my subjective intentionality? Which of the two is the Gemara saying? And we can find two sorts of evidence to answer our question. Number one, in the halachic language and the Rishonim and Achronim and so on, who deal with this, do they talk about intentionality or structure, objective or subjective, we can call it? That's number one. And the second piece of evidence we can look for is what happens if it is impermanent. Is it mutter, in which case it's indicative that Tofer is different to other melachas, or is it potter avalosa, rabbinically forbidden, in which case it would suggest it's part of the general family of rules of melachas which are osa midrabanon. So these are the two pieces of evidence that we're going to need to look for. And on the source sheets, I printed some Makomas connected with this, including one from the Ramah, which we looked at last time. So let's just try and have a look at some of the rayas either way. For now, I'm going to assume that the rayas I share with you, I'm not going to unpick the rayas, I'm going to assume these are good proofs. Next week, we'll see whether this is entirely accurate, whether these proofs are good proofs. But for now, I'm just taking you on the journey I went on in trying to understand this, where at least initially I took these Makomas on face value and perhaps missed some of the subtleties involved. So the first source, which is the Ramah, is really, I was being a bit lazy over here, it's really a Machlokas Rishonim. Just the Ramah neatly summarizes the Machlokas Rishonim because the Ramah brings both opinions on the matter. And these are Rishonim that I didn't have on my Bar Ilan database and therefore weren't easy to print. And they're also Rishonim that are off the daf, and therefore I just used the Ramah as a sort of shortcut to bringing these viewpoints. But let's have a look at the Ramah together. So the Ramah in Siman Shin Yod Zayin Sif Gimel, in which the Ramah brings the following scenario. I put the rest of it in grey font just to make it clear that that's not the ikka of the Maramakum. Whenever I put something in grey font as opposed to back font, it means you should have a brief glance at the grey font just so you see in context what it's talking about. But our focus and Shiur will be on the black font. That's what I do just to make it a little clearer. So the top part of the Ramah, it's I'm not even going to mention it. It's dealing with the issue of tightening and loosening threads and things like that. And then the Ramah says as follows: one isn't allowed to cut or break or cut a pair of shoes which are sewn together in the way that craftsmen used to do. Even though this is an impermanent stitching. Now, I don't know exactly the Metzias, and unfortunately, both in this case and in the next source that I printed, I struggled to understand exactly what the setup was. The next source, in source 3, the Carbon Asanel uses Yiddish terms and that I was not able to fully translate. Some of them I know, some of them I don't know. So I'm not sure I've got exactly the Metzias, but apparently shoemakers used to stitch pairs of shoes together, and that's how they sold them. We have a similar phenomenon nowadays. If you buy Crocs or slippers or things like that, and even shoes sometimes, they're often laced together or held together with a sort of plastic tag just to keep the pair together. For obvious reasons, you want to keep a pair of shoes together. So it appeared that when they used to make shoes, the shoemakers would stitch the shoes together. And the Ramah says you're not allowed to uncut them on Shabbos. Now the Ramah then asks a question on himself. He says, even though this is an impermanent stitching, nonetheless, when it comes to stitching, there's no difference between kayama and ein shel kayama. What on earth does the Ramah mean? The Ramah is going against an explicit Gemara that says that tefillah does need to be shel kayama. That's how sugya. So what does the Ramah mean when he says that by tefillah there's no distinction between tefillah shel kayama and tefillah shel kayama? How can the Gemara say that? The Gemara tells us explicitly tefillah does need to be shel kayama.
I'm not going to help you with that answer. I mean, our thought when we looked at it, Rabbi Zobin, was actually the first bit of the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, was important in that we read it. I read it as it was a matakein situation, which was a case of makkah b'potish, and therefore the lachein bit goes on the fact that as this is a situation of makkah b'potish, it doesn't matter whether the tefillah is shal kayama or ein shal kayama because it's a makkah b'potish situation.
Okay, so I'm not going to go like that, though I hear what you're saying. Partly because of the language of the Ramah, in which the Ramah says the issue is that there's no chiluk between ben shal kiyama and ein shal kiyama.
But what about the lachein?
The Mishnah Berurah speaks about how to learn the flow of the Ramah based on this. I actually originally put the Mishnah Berurah in and then took it out because I didn't want to complicate things. So maybe in hindsight that was wrong. I think on the last short sheet, I may have printed the Mishnah Berurah. Did I print the Mishnah Berurah on the Ramah in the last short sheet? I don't remember.
We're talking here about unpicking it, aren't we?
Yes.
So maybe when it says there's no chiluk between tefillah shakayama and shakama, that there is a chiluk when you're actually doing the tefillah, but when you're unpicking it, unpicking, it makes no difference whether the original thing done shakayama or not.
Okay, so this is the point that I said I would get to next week. In your normal analytical ability to get straight to the point, you're absolutely right, Max. This is one direction one could have gone. I didn't go this direction. I assumed, possibly wrongly, possibly rightly, that unpicking and picking two melachos are symmetrical melachos, and therefore both halves would behave symmetrically. And for now, I'm going to assume that that's not the answer. Not because your answer is necessarily wrong; it may well be right. But because I think there's a more basic point that I want to bring out over here, which is directly connected with our discussion. And I only arrived at your thought much later on, actually, my own thinking process. But it's definitely an important point to make. So for now, since Max has raised this, I'll spell this out explicitly. For now, I'm assuming there's no difference between Tofer and Korea, the two halves, the two twin melachas. We looked at kosher and matir, knotting and unknotting. And now we're looking at Tofer and Korea, and I'm assuming that they behave identically, which is the reasonable assumption to make, I think, and that's why I assumed it.
But the Ramah is making the distinction between the Rabbanan and Doraita. In other words, the Gemara is talking Doraita, and he's just saying Asur.
Again, Paul, you're absolutely correct. We need to think about Doraita and Rabbanon. Nonetheless, the statement of the Ramah of "Ein chiluk b'tefillah ben shal kiyama le'ein shal kiyama" is an interesting one. is it true to say there's no distinction? But again, Paul, you're absolutely right. Next week we will visit this topic, or maybe even this week near the end if we get up to it. Maybe what's going on here is a chiluk between the Derais and the Drabanon.
Can't we say in the Gemara that when the Gemara says it's not kayama and that's the problem, it's because it's an inferior malacha, because it's never going to hold together. Whereas in this Ramah, when he's talking about there's no difference, he's referring to the point you just made, that subjectively, the person obviously never wanted it to be together. I mean, it's a good binding because the shoes aren't coming apart.
Okay, so this is the first distinction I leapt to. And I'm not just going to it first because I happen to think of it first, but because I think it's the most fundamental chiluk that you need to say. You know, in learning one often, I've used this mashal before, but I just want to reiterate it again, particularly because I used it many years ago when actually only a tiny minority of this group were already learning with me. If I'm standing with an umbrella over my head and I say to you, why am I not getting wet? There are two answers you could give me. One answer is because you've got an umbrella over your head protecting you. And the second answer could be, well, because it's not raining. So we always need to think, what is the one that's getting most to the root? And if that turns out to be wrong, then to go to the secondary one. You first need to check whether it's raining. If it turns out to be raining, then I need to think, do I have an umbrella that's protecting me or not? And I would argue it's the same thing over here, which is Max's point and Paul's point are absolutely right. And we will see that we do need perhaps to come on to them later. We need to think about Derais and Drabanon. We need to think about the symmetry between sewing and unsewing later. But the most fundamental point is, do we have our terms clear? Our Gemara is arguably saying that a stitch which is structurally, fundamentally, objectively loose, weak, impermanent, is not the melacha. The Ramah is saying that this stitch is a great stitch, it's a permanent stitch. They've stuck it together much like the tags in modern day footwear. This is stitched together very, very well. The point that makes it impermanent is that no one has any intentionality to leave the stitching. It's a temporary way of holding it together. In which case, this first view of the Ramah is arguing that the pshat in the Gemara, in our Gemara, is that when the Gemara says Tofer is not shel kayama, it means it's structurally, fundamentally unsound, rather than I have intentionality to unstitch it. So this would appear to be how this voice in the Ramah is learning. And the Ramah, by the way, cites his source. He says this is the Hagahas Modchai. And this is, if you look there, this is clearly the point of discussion over there. The first opinion in the Ramah holds that since the stitch is permanent, even though it was made to be impermanent, that is osa or perhaps even chayev on Shabbos. I should mention, by the way, with reference to Paul's point, that even though the Rambam is careful to distinguish between osa and chayev, and we can be medayik in the Rambam whether it's Deraisa or Drabanon, and the Gemara itself is careful to distinguish between osa and chayev, the Shulchan Aruch is not careful like that. So in the Shulchan Aruch, one can't always deduce from osa versus chayev whether the Shulchan Aruch means to say Deraisa or Drabanon. I'm not entirely clear why the Shulchan Aruch chose to be imprecise in this area, and the Ramah they chose not to make this distinction. One answer could be because they didn't want to make the distinction. Since they are practical halachic works, either way you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos, and therefore they didn't bother distinguishing it. The problem with this is that sometimes it's very useful to know whether something is Deraisa or Drabanon. For example, in situations of emergency, where you need to break one or the other, or in situations of amira la'akum, of instructing a non-Jew. So it's unclear why the Shulchan, unclear to me, why the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah didn't always make the distinction, but you can't always be medayik it. So this is what I think is the most fundamental point to say in the Ramah. Before we look at other distinctions, which may absolutely be true about Deraisa Drabanon, or a distinction between knotting and unknotting. And the first and most basic one is, maybe there's a problem with terminology over here. When the Gemara says Tofer needs to be shel kayama, it means fundamentally so, structurally so, whether it's a sound or unsound knot, much like the halacha in all melachos that we've seen in building and in kosev and in bone and other melachos. And all the Ramah is saying over here is it doesn't have the chiddush that we saw does apply to Tofer, that even al-manas is enough to make it impermanent. So says the first opinion of the Ramah. Then the Ramah brings a second opinion. V'yesh matzirim b'tfira she'ena shel kayama There are those who are lenient with the tefira she'ena shel kayama. He brings this from the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef is Rabbi Yosef Cairo, himself quoting Rishonim. The Rishon are several Rishonim, including a source brought by the first source of the Ramah, the Hagos Mordechai, who brings from Rabbeinu Yoel, etc., who hold it is mutter to unstitch this stitching on Shabbos because it is impermanent, which presumably means intentionality of impermanence. In which case, it's a machlokas Rishonim how to learn the halacha of tefira. Is it like all other melachos dependent on structural impermanence, or is it unique in that it depends on intentionality also? And also note that this second opinion says mutter. And here we get to Paul's point, because seemingly these 2 points are interdependent. If you hold that a melacha she'ena shel kayama is the general rule of impermanent melachos, then number one, it will depend on structure, not intentionality. And number two, it will still be osad rabbanon. Whereas if you hold there's a unique halacha with Tofer that even intentionality matters, we see that it's different to other melachos, in which case it would make sense that it's mutter, not just potter avol osa. So the second opinion of the Ramah seems to be a very powerful source to argue that even intentionality is enough, and uniquely, unlike other impermanent melachos, it's therefore mutter, not just potter avol osa. And then in a very interesting line, which I'm not going to go into now, the Ramah says that ein lahate bifnei am haaretz. One shouldn't do this melacha in front of an am haaretz because it's a confusing melacha. An unlearned observer will not understand. It seems very counterintuitive. You take out on Shabbos a pair of scissors and you snip your way through the threads binding the shoes. This looks like an absolute chilul Shabbos. To the observer, this is horrific. And therefore, the Ramah says, don't do this melacha, don't do this non-melacha, don't do this act in front of an unlearned person who won't understand, and they'll think what they're seeing is chilul Shabbos, and they won't understand the distinction over here. Okay, so this is a machlokas Rishonim. So we've now answered, I think, successfully our first question that we asked in the sugya, which is this a permanent? Is this when the Gemara says you need tefira shel kayama? Does it mean the general rule in all melachos that all melachos need to be structurally permanent, or is it a specific rule unique to Tofer and perhaps also to kosher? Interestingly, these two, because they're both connecting melachos, in which even intentionality, even though structurally it's a perfectly sound strict, but intentionality wise, I don't intend to leave it permanent, that would be enough to make it not the melacha. And more than that, therefore to mean it's mutter, not just potter avol osa. So we'll stop there for today, and Mitzvah Hashem, on Tuesday we will continue with this topic.
Can I ask a quick question, please?
Please do, Josh.
So for the issue of kosher and the intentionality kayama, does it? I don't remember. Maybe I misread last sugya. I don't remember. Does that exclude the other kind of kayama? What? It doesn't.
No.
So why should it?
Yeah. Sorry.
Why should it be mutter? So I've still got the two pairs of shoes that are bound together with a tofer uman, right? So how do you end up with a mutter situation? Okay,
excellent question. So first of all, no, it doesn't. If it's a kal v'chomer, if anything. If even something which is structurally sound is not awesome in our Torah because of intentionality, how much more so the general melacha rule of structurally unsound applies to it. So that's point number one. Point number two is why then should it become mutter as opposed to potter avol osa? I'm not arguing that it's obvious. You could have imagined a takana drabanon to say it's osa even here. I'm simply pointing out that with kosher we find that it's mutter, not just potter avol osa, unlike other impermanent melachos. So presumably the logic is that since it has an extra leniency in which intentionality is also a factor, therefore Chazal understood it was different to other melachos and didn't include it in the general rule that something which is allowed min haTorah because it's impermanent is nonetheless osam midrabanon, because over here there was a unique quality. There's an additional Torah law, and on that additional Torah law they didn't bother making midrabanon, and therefore it remains mutter always. In other words, every case of structural impermanence would also be intentionality impermanence. That it's not to say it has to be that way. We could have imagined the world where they would have also made the takana drabanon there, but nonetheless we find with kosher they didn't do so. And interestingly, if we find with Tofer that an impermanent melacha is mutter, that would also indicate the same sort of idea that tefira like kosher, because it has this unique leniency of intentionality being a matter, they didn't create a drabanan there and left it as mutter, not just pater avlasa.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, we'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much.
No,
Thank you.
very
Have a
much.
good day.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.